It's not just about being organic. I mean, in general, local, if you compare prices at a farmer's market, local and organic tend to be pretty close to each other. If you look at the grocery store, there's a significant difference because, it's a whole different ball game in terms of when you're dealing with really large farms, which, even organic farms are pretty mechanized and huge out there in California. But I just try to explain to them, the really, really cheap produce that you're purchasing at the grocery store is cheap for a reason. There are a lot of synthetic chemicals that are used that enable the farmer to keep prices a little bit lower because they're able to produce on such a huge scale, and basically because they're poisoning things that are competing with the crops, so it's creating less work for them and they're able to do more things on a tractor. And organic standards require that you do as much as possible to prevent disease and pest problems, and then the next step, if you do have some sort of infestation, is to try and control it with what are called biological or cultural methods. So, using
like nematodes.
Using like beneficial insects, nematodes and ladybugs and those things, but also using a row cover to cover your plants right after you plant them to exclude certain pests, or removing them by hand or like with a vacuum if you have an infestation of like Colorado potato beetles on your potato plants and things like that. And then if it looks like you're going to have a crop failure, then you can move on to using something remedial, a pesticide. All organic pesticides are derived, I think there's a huge misconception that organic farmers don't use pesticides. They do. But they are all naturally derived and they're not persistent in the soil, so the likelihood of those pesticides killing other things that are beneficial is much less, although there are some pretty potent organic pesticides. Not much in the way of herbicides though, which is good. So I kind of try to explain that, what the difference in, it costs a lot more because there's a lot more manual labor involved in trying to raise healthy plants. You're building up the soil, you're feeding the soil and trying to, I'm putting compost on this soil. Every handful of compost has 2 billion organisms. And, I've got clover pathways that are helping to fix nitrogen, trying to do things that keep the soil alive rather than killing everything off in it with some sort of synthetic pesticide. But, I'm doing this all by hand. You don't have to do it all by hand, but it's a much more intensive process, and you're trying to feed the soil, which then in turn feeds the plants, whereas a lot of conventional food is grown with synthetic fertilizers that they're just trying to give a shot of nitrogen to the plant that is a synthetic shot of nitrogen. So, what's taken up by the plant and then put into the fruit that you're going to eat is synthetically derived. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it's not nutritious, but I like to think that, it's probably makes a difference. So that's part of the reason being certified is kind of important to me, I guess. There's a system of accountability and a standard, albeit one that's set by the government, and one that, if I had it my way, it would be the other way around. You'd have to get certified to spray crap all over your food. Use the precautionary principle like they do in Europe. But we're not there right now, so until then, unfortunately, organic food is going to cost a little bit more because the farmer has to pay for the price of certification and spend a little bit more money, a lot more money, especially on labor, to do those things that keep plants healthy and free of synthetic chemicals. It's kind of crazy, all of the work that goes into getting certified organic. It's not that bad. You should be keeping those records anyway, I think. You know, what you put on your field and when, and that's just smart farming practice and a smart business practice. But
Yeah.
but I can see why people don't want to do it.
To be certified, is that per individual crop, or is that for the entire operation?
It depends. So Rhea is certifying her hay through my business, and all of the vegetable crops and flowers and everything is all one fee. If I had livestock that I also wanted to certify, that would be additional. If there's something that you want to throw in that's like a different product, they tack on more. But it's basically for your whole operation. I mean, if it was per crop, a lot of small organic veggie farmers will farm, 180 plus different crops, and that's a huge part of, having that diversity it's a security. So if something does wipe out all of your Swiss chard, like it's doing with mine right now, you've got all these other things to fall back on. But it would also, the process of paying, or I guess the cost would be too great if you had to certify every single crop. But they do go through and they look at every single crop, and they look at every single seed packet, and they make sure that you're looking at, can I source this seed organically? Okay, no. If not, can I get it from a source that's untreated?
Yeah.
But yeah, so it's just the whole operation, and then it's usually vegetables, and then they're like field crops and row crops, and livestock. The NOP, the National Organic Program, through the USDA sets out all of the organic standards, and that's basically where all of the different certification agencies, like they're usually nonprofits or often nonprofits. Like I certify through OFA, Ohio Ecological Food and Farm Alliance. The agency that sends out the inspectors to the farms and goes through all your paperwork and keeps up with all of the guidelines, and is a resource for farmers when it comes to answering their questions about certification. They're the ones that set the price. So I think this year it was $950 to certify. That's every year, which is expensive. There used to be a cost share through the USDA, through the Farm Bill. And that's gone now in Michigan. So that's a big deterrent, a big barrier for a lot of farmers, is they don't have that cash to front, and in a lot of areas it's not worth it to certify. Like here, the reason I certified was because I'm selling transplants, and there were a couple of organic farmers that wanted to buy transplants from me, and so those orders paid for my certification, so it made it worth it to me. But I can't necessarily charge a premium for my product at this point. I think at ELFCO, it's sort of expected that produce is going to be sustainably grown, or, ecologically produced, or whatever people call it. But yeah, so it's a major deterrent. It's pretty expensive, but at the same time, there's a price premium for organics. If there's a demand for it, and I'm starting to see more of a demand among people at market, then it's worth it, because you can make that, $1,000 back pretty quick.
What sort of inputs do you have here to your soil?
So that was a big, so the first thing we put in here was buckwheat. It's a good potassium forager, and the this soil is low in potassium. So it'll forage for that, and then you mow it down and it decomposes and just adds to the soil. You know, the soil microbes will eat that up and poop it out, and you know, every time you do that, it's called green manure. Like this clover, you know, so I seeded this in the fall, and it made a pretty nice stand this spring, and I've just been mowing it, and every time you mow it, it goes back down and feeds the soil. And then I just tilled in, and I'm leaving these clover pathways, but I tilled it in. You know, you can see this is the clover that I just tilled this morning. This will turn into nothing by tomorrow. I'll be able to plant into it some things like rye, things that are a little bit more fibrous take a little bit longer to break down, but you're basically feeding the soil, you're feeding the microbes in the soil, and they're doing all the work for you. So you're adding soil organic matter. It's like adding compost, but without the composting process. You just let the microbes in the soil, keep them healthy, and just feed them with green manure. So I use cover crops and a lot of compost. I spread a lot of compost, 20 yards to this acre, so which is, you know, ends up sort of like being a dusting when it comes down to it. But I also, you know, put it exactly where I'm going to plant the plants to give them a little bit of a boost when you plant them. And those are the main things I use. If you know, and it's important to get a soil test every year, so to see if you're deficient in anything. All of this soil tends to be pretty acidic, so we added lime. And then deficient in potassium, so we added potash, potassium sulfate. And just those things are mined, which isn't ideal, but it's the kind of thing
natural.
It's natural, and it helps give, you know, that microbial community a little boost. And then, you know, like I said, you can use cover crops and other things to sort of balance it out. And with regular compost applications, things will sort of start to equalize. And certain crops need certain conditions, you know, but in general, for diverse vegetable production, pretty good with compost.